Hello YouTube, this is Boston Best 047, and this is not going to be an addendum exactly, but more of a side note to my last video. And I remember in my last video I was giving a analysis of the gender pay gap. I was giving my take on it, and I used a vaguely Marxian perspective on that. And it's sort of a weird thing because I describe myself as being a conservative person. And conservative people almost universally detest Marxism. They regard Marxism as being they equate Marxism with evil. Effectively, it's like the Satanism of politics or something for Christians. It's something universally detested, but it's also something it's also completely misunderstood. Marx is probably the second most, if not the most, misunderstood philosopher next to, say, Nietzsche, for example. And it's sort of weird, when you discuss this. And I was a little weird about it. And I think to myself, because I'm in my 20s, I'm only 22, for example, and I was like 1 years old, probably 12 months old almost when the uh, Soviet Union fell, which was like 1991. Um, and so I don't have all this sort of weirdness about Marxism. Um, that a lot of people have, and I think to myself, it's the end of the Cold War. The Cold War's been over for almost 20 years, for over 20 years, right? At this point, can we please become a little bit more rational as it regards Marx? Marx was not the crazy, psychopathic, sociopathic, satanic, baby killing, drinking the blood of virgins, political philosopher that people make him out to be. Not even close. Right wingers literally equate evil with Marxism. Indeed, what almost defines a right winger is how and to what extent he's anti-communist. Now, communism was very bad. Communism was very evil. Communism was a pure evil, right? I agree with. I agree. It was destructive, and flawed and bad. But ultimately, there's a fundamental difference between politicized Marxism that helped to create communism in the Soviet Union and what Marx had originally written. The truth about Marx is really that you have to take Marx with a grain of salt. You have to treat reading Marx like you're reading an old ancient scripture. You take most skeptical people, for example, would read the Bible or the Quran with a certain grain of salt, understand these are ancient people thinking, about these things, that they probably didn't understand science, things like that. Skeptical people think of it like that, and that's the exact same way you have to think of Marx, because much of what Marx wrote, he did not finish. It was finished for other people, and much of it was hard to interpret. He didn't explain everything that he said. He had far more that he was planning to write that he never wrote. And so you have to understand Marx in a certain context. And you ultimately have to understand that Karl Marx was a social theorist, not a revolutionary per se, the way people like to think of him. And he was involved in revolutionary politics and things like that. He was involved in that. But ultimately, that's how you have to think of him. You have to really take him with a grain of salt. You have to treat him like you treat, I don't want to sound sacrilegious exactly, but you have to treat him like you treat Jesus, a lot of people believe Jesus didn't even exist, and stuff like that. So you got to take Marx, but they would hate Marx. But you have to take Marx with a grain of salt. Really have to take him with a grain of salt, and that's something that people don't understand about Karl Marx. But this video is really going to be about my own history with Marxism. When I was like 18, 19, I did flirt with Marxism a little bit, but I was always a vocal Marxist. I always thought Marx was ultimately a historical determinist, that he believed socialism would evolve organically and communism would evolve organically, as opposed to the revolutionary thought. It's hard to understand. This is one of the big paradoxes of modern Marxism, in that Marxism, as it occurred, as it occurred in the 20th century, was ironic because why would you have, for example, a theory of history if if you want revolution? It doesn't really correlate very well. And ultimately, the primary reason this all happened is because of politics, is because of this need of revolution that happened. Lenin, for example, took his ideas and applied them to a society where it was not intended to ever occur for entirely political reasons. The reason why Marxism always occurred in the less industrialized countries is because there was a political need for it, because they weren't industrializing. They didn't have a bourgeoisie to do it for them. And so that's what they argued for. That's why they did what they did. So this was not genuine communism. This was state capitalism. And they regarded themselves as being such. They didn't see themselves as communists, but we saw them as being communists in the West. But when all of this is really examined, when all of this is really looked at, there's really no reason for all the craziness that occurs. But there's a political need for it when you're a Westerner in the West, when you're a Western capitalist, for example, for it. And really, I think, as far as the Cold War, the Soviet Union could never have competed with us. I think most people who really understand the issue know that they could have never competed with the West. They had no ability, really, to compete with the West. And ultimately, they were always destined to fall or to collapse. And people had been predicting the collapse for 20 years prior to it. It was always unstable, and they always had lofty goals, and it was always unrealistic, and it was always destined to fall apart. But people today still cling to the evil of Marxism. Part of it's because the modern post-communist Marxists are crazy people and are all radicals and have no concept of reality. So they're scary people, and I find them just as scary. And I left Marxism, I abandoned it when I realized how unrealistic it was and how lofty their goals were. And really, at the end of the day, how unnoble. I remember I said in one of my videos, and I think the two words don't really connect exactly, but I said in reassessing men's rights, the men's rights movement, that leftists or liberals have lofty goals and even very noble goals, where the communists have lofty goals and they're not particularly noble either. So it's very flawed. But what I've come to after thinking about it for a very long time, thinking about it for the last year or so, that ultimately I came to a more traditionalist conservative view of the world from my Marxism. Ironically, I'm really a lot like and I don't know him very well, so I'm not trying to compare myself to him. I haven't really been able to read his stuff. I just know some little bit about his background. But Eugene Genovese, for example, who went from being a Marxist writer, a Marxist historian, to being a traditionalist conservative, and still being anti-capitalist or being critical of capitalism, but from a traditionalist conservative perspective. So my problems with capitalism, after a while, became traditionally conservative problems with capitalism. And part of this reason is why I regard myself as a centrist in a lot of ways, because ultimately I don't fall into the modern right, I don't fall into the modern left. And in many ways I'm a centrist, but ultimately I'm a traditionalist conservative overall, in that I regard the organic society, the organic unity, the agrarian society, the organic unity, I should say, of the agrarian society as superior to modern society. Traditional society superior to modern society. Now, I think ultimately, Marx was in many ways a reactionary. I think, and I plan to do a separate video as why I think that. But Marx, I think, was a reactionary in a lot of ways, because he was looking at the world and he was responding to the changes, the radical changes that capitalism was creating, and being critical of it, and saying, the bourgeoisie, they always have to revolutionize technology. I have problems with that. I can't deal with the changes of capitalism. I've always had this problem. I don't like technology very much. I'm not a particularly technologically oriented person, actually, even though I'm like 22. And I've always felt like I'm an old man in my own body, like the way I think about things. I've always been old fashioned. I've always had an instinct for being old fashioned for a lot of reasons. And I have problems with capitalism for those reasons. But the problem at Marx is that Marx embraced social progress. He believed the liberal ideal. And that was the problem with Marx. Marx's ultimate problem was that he believed the liberal ideal. He believed the lie of liberalism. He believed the lie of social progress and of equality. And while I personally think that there's probably a certain instinct for equity and a balance in the human species, equality, as it's thought of in the modern era, either as one of outcome or as one of opportunity, is not particularly realistic. and ultimately living in a traditional organic society where people actually related to each other, where people actually had genuine relationships, where things were genuine. I would rather live like that than I would live in what we have today. We become more nihilistic, nihilism increasingly becomes the case. But I think productive nihilism, with science, for example, the more you learn about what we are, the more you learn about the universe, the more you learn about the nature of life, the more nihilistic you become, the more you become, more the meaningless of life. And it makes me conclude from nihilism. It makes me conclude, for example, that there are certain things about the universe that we were never intended to know. There are some things we were never intended to know about ourselves. And this is I think, the ultimate sadness, the ultimate, pessimism I come to about the way things are. But I think nihilism becomes productive only when you come to a stronger conclusion, a higher conclusion about human nature, about life itself, and we conclude, for example, that there are certain things we never intend to know about ourselves. And so it's from this that I would conclude. It's why I tend to be a philosophical I'm not really even an outright nihilist, but I'm more of a philosophical pessimist than a straight nihilist. But I think productive nihilism would be that. Ironically, communism, for example, is nihilism taken to its logical. It's pure nihilism, in the sense that communism, as Marx pointed out in the Communist Manifesto, annihilates, destroys eternal. I forget how he said it exactly, but it obliterates eternal truth. It abolishes all eternal truth, religion, things like that. And ultimately, that this was ultimately a good thing. And I floated with this for a while when I was younger, and sort of believed this type of nihilism, and thought this was a good thing, coming to this conclusion that blackness and darkness is just that, it's like darkness coming to the light, coming back to the darkness, in a sense. But ultimately, I believe something slightly different. This darkness, this return to the primitive, or whatever, the primordial, would be something actually liberating. It's liberating to know the truth about human nature, and I would conflict with the nihilistic communist view. Why I end up breaking with it, but why I also came to the conclusions I have now about the world and how the world works. Because ultimately, you should come to the realization that what you knew was always the case. You know what I'm saying? There's probably some sort of Eastern philosophy. I think it sounds sort of vaguely Eastern to me. I don't know that much about that kind of thing. I know only just a scratch of it. But you come to a realization that things always were what you always knew. And I come to the conclusion that, yeah, we always were what we are. How should I say this exactly? We should come to the conclusion that what we know has always been the case. We are tribal creatures. We evolved to live in tribes. We have gender distinction. We have sexual distinctions based on biology, that men and women are different, but that we ultimately complement each other. Things like that are the kind of conclusion that I've come to out of having been that. And I think it's interesting when you look at subcultures, for example. Subcultures that were at one point left-wing, becoming more right-wing. Punk wouldn't be a good example, but black metal. If you look at, say, black metal, for example, black metal music, the music that I play, that I'm interested in, black metal started out as it came from punk, for example, and punk has traditionally always been left-wing music with that kind of nihilism in it. And a lot of black metalers embrace or flirt with nihilism, or flirt with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very popular among black metalers to a certain degree. There's a website called anus.com, for example, which is American Nihilist Society, or I forget what it's called, American Nihilist Underground Society, which are philosophical nihilists, and they promote black metal on their website, and they write about black metal. And it's an interesting site, and I never really used to be into it that much. I used to kind of get like cynical about the sort of right-wing vibe of the website. But I've over time I've come to kind of embrace that and look at the world from more of that perspective a little bit. And it's interesting because ultimately, you come to you should come to a more profound truth about human nature. You should come to the conclusion that you find out we are animals, but we are animals. And what do we know the whole time? We have that instinct in us. It's that tribal instinct that comes back, that should come back. And I think it sounds, like I said, it sounds vaguely Eastern. But that's some of my history of Marxism, and why I still ultimately think the Marxist view is a good one, is a useful one, but that it has to be taken with a grain of salt. So anyway, that's all I have to say, and I hope this wasn't rambly. I hope this makes sense, and I'm sure no one will watch it because nobody watches my videos anyway. So anyway, that's it, and talk to you later. Bye.